Robert had lived in Oakwood Heights for 15 years now. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every seasonal decoration his neighbors put up, and exactly when Mr. Wilson, 2 doors down, would start his lawnmower every Saturday morning. This neighborhood was his sanctuary, a place where things ran like clockwork. The moving trucks showed up on a Tuesday. Robert watched from behind his living room curtains as the new family unloaded furniture into the Taylor house across the street. The Taylors had moved to Florida after retirement, and their house had been on the market for almost 6 months. Black family, Robert muttered to himself, noticing the husband directing movers while the wife pointed where things should go. Their teenage son was bouncing a basketball in the driveway, the rhythmic thumping already getting on Robert's nerves. That night at dinner, Robert mentioned the new neighbors to his wife, Diane. "The Browns moved in across the street today," he said, stabbing at his meatloaf. "That's nice," Diane replied, not looking up from her plate. "Maybe we should take them something, welcome them to the neighborhood." Robert grunted. "Let's see how they settle in first." 3 weeks passed. Robert kept detailed mental notes about the Browns. They were loud, at least by Oakwood Heights standards. Their son, who looked about 16, practiced basketball almost every evening. They had family over on weekends, cars lining the street and laughter spilling out until after dark. They'd painted their front door a bright blue without getting HOA approval first, and they'd replaced the Taylors' carefully maintained roses with vegetables and herbs. "It's bringing down property values," Robert complained to Diane one evening after spotting Mr. Brown installing solar lights along their walkway, definitely not the approved landscape lighting in the HOA guidelines. "They seem nice enough," Diane said mildly. "Mrs. Brown, Theresa, I think, waved to me yesterday when I was getting the mail." "That's not the point," Robert insisted. "There are rules here. Standards. That's why we pay HOA fees." The final straw came on a Saturday in June. The Browns were hosting what looked like a family reunion. Cars filled their driveway and lined both sides of the street. Music played, not loud enough to call the police, but enough that Robert could hear the bass from his backyard. The smell of barbecue drifted over, making his mouth water despite his irritation. Later that day, he saw Mr. Brown's elderly father struggling to walk up the driveway, leaning heavily on a cane. The old man paused, breathing hard in the summer heat. Mrs. Brown rushed out to help him, followed by their son who took his grandfather's other arm. The care they showed touched something in Robert, but he pushed the feeling away. That evening, after most guests had left, Robert noticed Mr. Brown, he still didn't know the man's first name, building something in the backyard. By Sunday afternoon, a large wooden structure stood where the Taylors' bird bath had been. Some kind of garden trellis, Robert guessed, definitely not on the approved structures list. Robert sat at his computer that night, the HOA complaint form open on the screen. He began typing, listing every violation he observed. Unauthorized paint color, unapproved landscape changes, excessive street parking, noise disturbances. His finger hovered over the send button. Through his window, he could see the Browns' house, warm light spilling from their windows. Their son was taking out trash, and Mr. Brown came out to help with the heavier bags. They were talking, laughing about something. Robert pressed send. 3 days later, a notice from the HOA appeared on the Browns' door. Robert watched from his kitchen window as Mr. Brown read it, his shoulders slumping slightly before he went inside. "It's just about following the rules," Robert told himself, turning away from the window. "Everyone has to follow the same rules." He had no idea what he'd just started. A week passed after the HOA notice, and nothing changed at the Browns' house. The blue door remained blue. The vegetable garden kept growing. The basketball still bounced in the driveway most evenings. Robert checked his mailbox one afternoon and spotted Mrs. Brown, Theresa, watering her plants. She smiled and waved. He gave a tight nod before hurrying back inside. They're ignoring the notice, Robert told his friend Paul over beers that weekend. They sat in Robert's garage with the door half open, watching the street. "Maybe they got permission," Paul suggested, taking a sip from his bottle. "No way," Robert said. "I checked with Linda on the board. They haven't even responded." Just then, 3 cars pulled up to the Browns' house. More visitors. Weekend company again. Robert shook his head as he watched Mr. Brown greet the newcomers with hugs. See what I mean? It's like they don't care about the neighborhood at all. Paul looked uncomfortable. They seem like nice people, Rob. My wife talked to Mrs. Brown at the grocery store, said she's real friendly. Robert snorted. Yeah, well, being friendly doesn't mean you can just ignore the rules everyone else follows. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. The sound of laughter drifting across the street kept him awake. He finally got up around 11:30 and peered through his blinds. The Browns and their guests were on the back patio, lights strung up, music playing softly. Nothing too loud, but enough to bother him. He grabbed his phone and took a video, making sure to get the timestamp. Then he recorded the sound level using an app he downloaded just for this purpose. The reading was 47 decibels, under the city's noise limit, but he saved it anyway. The next morning, Robert started a document on his computer. Brown Family Violations, he titled it. He wrote down every detail, dates, times, number of cars, activities. He took photos whenever he could, usually through his blinds or while pretending to check his mail. 2 weeks of documentation later, Robert felt ready. The HOA hadn't done enough, so he'd go further. He called the city's code enforcement office. I'd like to report several ongoing violations, he told the board-sounding clerk who answered. Address? The man asked. Robert gave the Browns' address and started listing his complaints. Unauthorized structures, parking violations, noise issues, possible business being run from the residence. Business? The clerk perked up. What kind of business? Robert hesitated. He didn't actually know if the Browns were running a business, but all those visitors had to mean something. I'm not sure, he admitted, but there are always different cars there, especially weekends, people coming and going. Could just be friends or family, the clerk said, his voice flat again. This many, every weekend, and sometimes they bring in coolers and boxes. Could be selling something. That got the clerk's attention. He promised someone would look into it. Diane wasn't happy when she found out. You called the city on them? For having family over? She stared at Robert like she didn't recognize him. It's more than that, Robert insisted. They're ignoring all the rules. What's the point of living in a nice neighborhood if people can just do whatever they want? Diane shook her head. I think you're taking this too far. The next day, a city inspector showed up at the Browns' house. Robert watched from his window as Mr. Brown led the man around the property, gesturing at different areas. They seemed to be having a calm conversation. The inspector took a few notes, then left. Nothing happened for 3 days, no citation, no changes at the Browns' house. Frustrated, Robert called the police non-emergency line. I'm concerned about possible illegal activity, he said carefully. He'd rehearsed what to say. Suspicious traffic patterns, different vehicles, regular gatherings. The officer who took his call didn't sound impressed. We'll send someone to drive by, she said. Robert wasn't satisfied. He needed to do more. These people needed to understand that Oakwood Heights had standards. That Sunday, he saw his chance. Mr. Brown was alone, unloading groceries from his car. Robert put on his shoes and walked across the street. Robert's heart pounded as he crossed the street. Mr. Brown had his back turned, reaching into the trunk for another grocery bag. Excuse me, Robert called out, his voice coming out sharper than he'd intended. Mr. Brown turned around, surprise flickering across his face. In the 3 months they'd been neighbors, this was the first time Robert had approached him directly. Hey there, Mr. Brown said, offering a smile. Robert, right, from across the street? Robert was caught off guard. He hadn't expected the man to know his name. That's right, he said stiffly. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about some concerns. Mr. Brown set down his grocery bags on the driveway. Sure, what's on your mind? His tone was friendly, open. Robert hadn't prepared for friendliness. He'd expected defensiveness, maybe even hostility. The man's calmness threw him off balance. It's about your... Robert gestured vaguely at the house, your changes to the property, and all the visitors. The noise. Mr. Brown's smile faded slightly. I see. Is something bothering you specifically? Everything. The word burst out of Robert. The door color. The garden. That structure in the backyard. All of it needed HOA approval first, and the parking situation on weekends is out of control. Some of us have lived here a long time, and we have standards in this neighborhood. People were watching now. Mrs. Chen was walking her dog and had slowed to observe them. A couple of kids on bikes had stopped at the corner. Mr. Brown took a deep breath. I understand you're concerned. We did actually submit paperwork for the trellis and the garden. The door, you're right, we should have asked first. My wife just loved that color, reminded her of her grandmother's house. Well, it's against the rules, Robert said. And what about all the people? Every weekend it's like Grand Central Station over here. What are you all doing anyway? Something shifted in Mr. Brown's expression. The friendliness disappeared, replaced by something harder. Those people are my family, he said quietly. My brother comes with his kids. My wife's sister visits with her husband. My father needs help getting around now, so he stays with us most weekends. Every weekend, though, Robert pressed. And all those boxes and coolers people bring? Looks suspicious. Mr. Brown stared at him. Suspicious? You think? He shook his head, disbelief clear on his face. Those are food containers. My sister-in-law bakes. My brother brings vegetables from his garden. We share meals. That's what families do. Robert felt a flicker of doubt, but pushed ahead. The HOA sent you a notice. The city inspector came by, but nothing's changed. We're working with the HOA, Mr. Brown said, his voice controlled but tight. The inspector found no violations. I'm trying to understand what your real problem is here, because it seems like. My problem is you people moving in and changing everything. Robert's voice had risen. He could hear how it sounded, but couldn't stop himself. Following the rules isn't optional. If you wanted to live however you wanted, you should have bought somewhere else. A heavy silence fell. Mr. Brown's face went very still. You people? He repeated quietly. Robert felt heat rising to his face. Homeowners who don't respect the community, he said, but the backpedaling was obvious. Mr. Brown carefully picked up his groceries. I think we're done here. But let me be clear, my family has every right to be in this neighborhood. We're not breaking any rules, and we're not going anywhere. He turned to go inside, then paused. You know what, Robert? You're always welcome to join us sometime. Meet the suspicious characters eating my sister-in-law's peach cobbler. Might change your perspective. The front door closed firmly, leaving Robert standing alone in the driveway. He became acutely aware of the neighbors watching. Mrs. Chen looked away quickly when he glanced in her direction. The kids on bikes whispered to each other. As Robert walked back across the street, shame and anger battled inside him. He wasn't wrong. He wasn't. These were legitimate concerns. But the look on Mr. Brown's face when he'd said, you people, kept replaying in his mind. 3 days after his confrontation with Mr. Brown, Robert found a white envelope in his mailbox. Inside was a notice about an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. The topic: addressing recent neighborhood concerns and promoting community harmony. Robert knew exactly what that meant. Someone had complained about him. Are you going? Diane asked when he showed her the notice. Of course I'm going, Robert said. This is my chance to get everyone to understand what's happening here. Diane looked uncertain. Rob, maybe you should let this go. The Browns seem like decent people. It's not about them being decent, Robert insisted. It's about them following the same rules as everyone else. But something had shifted inside him since the driveway confrontation. At night, he found himself replaying the conversation, wondering if he'd gone too far. The neighbors who'd witnessed the scene had been avoiding him. Even Mrs. Wilson, who usually waved from her garden, had hurried inside when she saw him coming. The evening of the meeting arrived. Robert spent an hour organizing his notes and printing photos of what he considered violations. He had a whole folder ready. I'm coming with you, Diane announced as he was about to leave. You don't need to. I do, she said firmly. I want to hear what everyone has to say. The community center was packed when they arrived. Robert had never seen so many neighbors at an HOA meeting before. Usually, it was just the board members and a handful of retirees with nothing better to do. Tonight, almost every household seemed to be represented. Robert noticed the Browns sitting near the front, but avoided looking directly at them. He and Diane found seats near the back. Linda Peterson, the HOA president, called the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, she began. As you know, there have been some tensions in our community recently. We're here to address concerns and find a way forward that works for everyone. Several neighbors spoke about noise complaints and parking issues, not just regarding the Browns, but throughout the neighborhood. The board proposed new guidelines for street parking and weekend gatherings. Then Linda said, "Before we vote on these proposals, we have a special guest who'd like to say a few words. Many of you may not have met her yet, but she's offered to help us navigate these issues." Robert watched as a woman walked to the front of the room. He recognized her as Mrs. Brown, though he'd mostly seen her from a distance. "Thank you for welcoming me tonight," she began. "For those who haven't met me yet, I'm Theresa Brown. My husband David and our son Tyler moved here 3 months ago." Her voice was warm but confident, like someone used to speaking to groups. "I understand there have been concerns about our family's impact on the neighborhood," she continued. "I hope we can address them directly and find solutions that work for everyone." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Before we moved here, I researched this community carefully," Theresa said. "Its excellent schools, low crime rate, and strong property values were all appealing. But I was also drawn to Oakwood Heights because of its diversity initiative." Murmurs spread through the room. Robert frowned. "What diversity initiative?" "For those who aren't aware," Theresa continued, "your HOA board applied for and received a community development grant last year specifically aimed at increasing neighborhood diversity and inclusion. That initiative is partly why we felt welcome to move here." Robert turned to look at Linda, who nodded in confirmation. "In my professional capacity," Theresa went on, "I work with communities throughout our state on exactly these kinds of transitions." She paused, smiling slightly. "Some of you may have seen the announcement last month. I've recently been appointed as the new district court judge for the county." A collective gasp went through the room. Robert froze, his folder of complaints suddenly heavy in his hands. "And in that role," Judge Theresa Brown continued, looking directly at the back of the room where Robert sat, "I'm particularly committed to ensuring that all citizens receive equal treatment under the law, including housing law." Robert couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin around him as he stared at Theresa Brown, Judge Brown, standing confidently at the front of the community center. His complaints folder sat heavy in his lap, suddenly feeling like evidence of something much worse than HOA violations. Diane squeezed his arm. "Did you know?" she whispered. He shook his head slightly, unable to speak. Judge Brown continued addressing the room. "I want to be clear that I'm not here tonight in my official capacity. I'm here as your neighbor, hoping we can work together to build the kind of community that benefits everyone." Her eyes moved across the room, briefly meeting Robert's before moving on. Had she recognized him? Did she know he was the one who'd confronted her husband? "My family chose Oakwood Heights because we believed in what this neighborhood could be," she said. "A place where different kinds of families could live together respectfully, where our son could grow up in a supportive environment." Linda Peterson stepped forward again. "We're so honored to have Judge Brown in our community." As she mentioned, last year the board did vote to participate in the county's neighborhood integration program. We received a grant that helped fund our new playground and community garden. Robert turned to look at Diane, whose expression showed she was as surprised as he was. How had he missed this? He attended most HOA meetings, but had missed a few last year when his mother was sick. "Now," Linda continued, "I believe someone wanted to raise specific concerns about recent neighborhood changes." This was his cue. This was when Robert was supposed to stand up, open his folder, and present his evidence of the Browns' violations. Every eye in the room turned toward him. Robert's mouth went dry. His hands trembled slightly as he looked down at his folder. Inside were photos of the Browns' blue door, their vegetable garden, their family gatherings. He'd documented license plate numbers of visitors. He'd recorded noise levels. He'd written out timelines. It all suddenly seemed so small, so petty. "Robert?" Linda prompted. "You had some concerns to share." Slowly, Robert stood. The folder clutched in his hands felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He began, then stopped, his voice failing him. Judge Brown watched him with a neutral expression, but her husband David sat beside her, his face showing clear recognition. This was the man Robert had confronted in the driveway just days ago, the man he'd practically accused of running some kind of illegal operation out of his home. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Robert finally managed to say. "I had some questions about neighborhood guidelines, but they've been answered." He sat down quickly, feeling sweat beading on his forehead. Diane placed her hand over his, a silent show of support that he didn't deserve. The meeting continued. New parking guidelines were proposed. A community picnic was planned for the following month. Someone suggested revitalizing the Neighborhood Watch program, and Judge Brown volunteered to help organize it. Through it all, Robert sat in stunned silence. He'd reported a judge to code enforcement. He'd called the police with vague accusations about a judge's family. He'd confronted and essentially harassed a judge's husband. As the meeting wrapped up, people gathered in small groups chatting. Robert wanted nothing more than to slip out unnoticed, but as he stood to leave, he found David and Theresa Brown standing in front of him. "Mr. Robert," David said, his voice calm, "I believe we have some unfinished business." Theresa extended her hand. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." Theresa Brown. Robert hesitantly shook her hand. "Robert Matheson, this is my wife, Diane." "Would you both join us for coffee?" Theresa asked. "I think it would be good for us to talk." There was nothing threatening in her tone, but Robert understood the weight of the invitation. This wasn't a friendly neighbor chat. This was a reckoning. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think that would be good." As they walked toward the exit together, Robert noticed other neighbors watching with curious expressions. His reputation in Oakwood Heights was about to change forever. The local coffee shop was nearly empty when Robert and Diane sat down across from David and Theresa Brown. An awkward silence hung over the table as the server brought their drinks. Robert stayed into his coffee, unable to meet the Browns' eyes. What could he possibly say? "Sorry I reported you because I didn't want black neighbors. Sorry I called the police on your family barbecues." The truth was too ugly to speak aloud. "So," David finally said, "I think we should clear the air." Robert nodded stiffly, still looking down. "Look at me, please," David said. His voice wasn't angry, just firm. Robert forced himself to meet David's gaze. "I know it was you who filed the complaints," David continued. "The HOA notices, the code enforcement visit, the police drive-bys. We've lived through this before in our last neighborhood." "I didn't." Robert began, then stopped. Denying it would only make things worse. "Yes, it was me." Theresa stirred her tea. "What I'd like to understand is why." The directness of her question caught Robert off guard. He'd expected threats about housing discrimination lawsuits or maybe professional consequences. Not this calm inquiry. "The rules," he said weakly. "The neighborhood standards." "The blue door?" David asked. "The garden? Those were worth all this?" Diane, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "It wasn't about the door," she said quietly. "Was it, Robert?" 3 pairs of eyes turned to him. Robert felt cornered, exposed. "I've lived here 15 years, he said finally. "Things were a certain way. Then you moved in and everything started changing." "What exactly changed?" Theresa asked. Robert struggled to find words that wouldn't sound as bad as the truth. More cars on the street. More noise. More people. "More black people," David said simply. The words hung in the air. Robert couldn't deny it. "I'm not. I don't consider myself," he stammered. "A racist?" David finished for him. "Most people don't. But look at what happened here. You saw a black family move in and immediately started looking for problems. Not once did you come talk to us directly, until that day in the driveway when you'd already decided we were doing something wrong." Robert felt shame burning through him. Put that way, his actions seemed indefensible. "What happens now?" he asked. "Are you going to file a complaint against me? Use your position to—" "My position?" Theresa interrupted, her eyebrows raised. "You think I'd abuse my authority as a judge for a personal grudge? That says more about you than me, Mr. Matheson." Robert flushed. She was right. "No," Theresa continued. "What happens now is up to you. We're neighbors. We're going to see each other every day. Our sons might end up in the same classes. We can either move forward or stay locked in this ugly place." "How?" Robert asked. "How do we move forward from this?" David leaned forward. Start by seeing us as people. Not as those black neighbors or the problem family. Just people. With jobs and a kid and aging parents, just like you. Robert nodded slowly. I can try to do that. That's step one, Theresa said. Step two is repairing the damage you've done. What do you mean? You've whispered to other neighbors, spread concerns, made us feel unwelcome in our own home, she explained. Those things need to be undone. The following week was the hardest of Robert's life. Word had somehow spread through the neighborhood about his campaign against the Browns and Judge Brown's identity. When he went to get his mail, conversation stopped. At the grocery store, people he'd known for years suddenly needed to rush off when they saw him. His friend Paul texted, "Heard what happened. Not cool, man." The isolation was crushing. This had been his community, his safe place. Now he was the neighborhood pariah. The final blow came when a letter arrived from the HOA board. It was a formal warning about actions detrimental to neighborhood harmony and a reminder about the community's non-discrimination policies. The letter was signed by all 7 board members, including his longtime friend Linda. Robert sat on his front step, letter in hand, feeling like his whole world had collapsed. Across the street, he could see the Browns' blue door, bright against their house. It looked nice, he realized. Different, but nice. Somewhere in this mess, he had lost his way, and he had no idea how to find it again. 3 weeks passed. Robert mostly stayed inside, avoiding the sideways glances and whispers that followed him around the neighborhood. He'd taken to ordering groceries for delivery and had started eating lunch at his desk at work instead of in the break room with colleagues. Diane tried to be supportive, but even she seemed disappointed in him. "You need to fix this," she told him one evening. "Not just for the neighborhood, but for yourself." "How?" Robert asked. "No one will even talk to me." "Maybe start with the people you hurt the most," she suggested quietly. Robert thought about it all night. The next morning, he found himself standing on the Browns' porch, heart pounding as he rang the doorbell. What would he say? What could he say? David answered, surprise clear on his face. "Robert," he said, "what can I do for you?" "I wanted to apologize," Robert said, the words rushing out before he could lose his nerve. "Really apologize, not just because I got caught or because your wife is a judge. I was wrong. About everything." David studied him for a long moment. "Would you like to come in?" The inside of the Browns' home was warm and welcoming, with family photos covering the walls. Robert noticed a bookshelf filled with law books, Judge Brown's, he assumed, and basketball trophies that must belong to their son. It looked like a home. A family's home. "Theresa's at work," David explained, leading Robert to the kitchen. "Can I get you some coffee?" "Sure," Robert said, still feeling awkward but grateful for the normal interaction. As David prepared the coffee, he asked, "So what made you come over today?" "I've been thinking a lot," Robert admitted, "about why I did what I did. It wasn't really about the rules or the property values." "I know," David said simply. "I grew up in a different time," Robert continued, "different place. I never thought of myself as prejudiced. But when you moved in, I just assumed the worst without even giving you a chance." David handed him a mug of coffee. "That's how it works, isn't it? Prejudice doesn't announce itself. It just quietly guides your assumptions." They talked for nearly an hour. Robert mostly listened as David shared stories about growing up black in America, about the countless times he'd been treated with suspicion for simply existing in spaces others thought he didn't belong. "The thing is," David said, "we can't change where we've been. Only where we're going." When Robert left, he felt lighter somehow. Nothing had been magically fixed, but it was a start. The following weekend, the neighborhood held its scheduled community picnic at the park. Robert almost didn't go, but Diane insisted. "You can't hide forever," she said. They arrived late, after most families were already settled on blankets and lawn chairs. Robert felt eyes on him as they walked through the crowd, searching for an empty spot. "Robert, Diane." A voice called out. It was Theresa Brown, waving them over. "We saved you some space." Robert hesitated, but Diane nudged him forward. The Browns had set up a large blanket with plenty of room for others. Their son Tyler was throwing a football with some other kids nearby. "Thank you," Robert said as they sat down. He noticed a few neighbors watching with interest. David told me you came by, Theresa said. That was a good first step. I'm trying, Robert admitted. We know, she replied. That's why we invited you to join the Neighborhood Diversity Committee. First meeting is next Tuesday. Robert looked surprised. You want me on that committee? After everything? Sometimes the people who need to be in the room most are the ones who think they don't belong there, she said. Later, as the afternoon wore on, Robert found himself helping David at the grill, flipping burgers for the neighborhood kids. Some neighbors still kept their distance, but others stopped by, making cautious small talk. Mrs. Chen, who had witnessed his confrontation with David weeks earlier, brought over her famous potato salad. Everyone deserves a second chance, she said quietly. As the sun began to set, Robert watched the scene around him, families of different colors and backgrounds sharing food and conversation. His neighborhood was changing, had been changing all along, and maybe just maybe he could change too. It wouldn't be easy. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. But standing there beside his new neighbor, passing out burgers to hungry kids who didn't care about the color of the hand that fed them, Robert felt something he hadn't expected: hope.